If you're born in England, you're English. If you're born in Russia, you're Russian. But it's a part of a people that we see here. It's also, ethnos is also labeled as a tribe. But if we look, we have a lot of race rising up against race today. And it grows more prominent as time goes on. When you think about the divide in today's society, you think about these groups that are coming up. Black Lives Matter. Yes, black lives do matter, but so do every other life on this planet. We care about lost souls. That's what's important to us. We don't see skin color. We don't look at people in any different light just because they have a different tone of skin. When you look at the divide, though, they say that people are inherently racist. That's the divide in race against race. One says there is, one says there isn't. One thing's abundantly clear. Hate is a learned trait. You're not born with hate in your heart. You're not born to say, oh, I'm going to hate this person or I'm going to hate that person. It's a learned trait. You must learn it. Society learns from watching the behaviors of others. So if you grow up with parents or you grow up with friends that say they hate this group or this person or that person, you had to learn that. And you picked it up from them. And it's passed on from generation to generation. In the greater picture, we should not celebrate that there's evil out there, but you should have a merry heart and rejoice, knowing that signs of the end of time, everything that we're seeing going on right now is pointing to the end. Why do we rejoice? Because Jesus said these things are the kickoff of the end of time. Be watchful, in other words. These are the signs that are at the end. The time is near. Do you see what's going on around you? Rejoice when you see nation rise against nation, or when you see race rise against race. And I'm not saying rejoice in the sense that people are being racist out there. I'm saying rejoice that God's given us a sign that we can know that His coming is soon. So we see nation against nation or race against race. How about kingdom against kingdom? Well, what is a kingdom, seeing that a nation is not what you traditionally think about as a nation? Kingdom is a jurisdiction, the territory or country subject to a king, an undivided territory under the dominion of a king or monarch, a region, a tract, the place where anything prevails and holds sway. Now that's an important definition there. And a princely nation or state. So a kingdom would be more in the sense of what we think of as the word nation. It's a territory under one ruler or one body. The second definition for kingdom here, though, is interesting because it gives credence to that ruling body or entity that can easily fit to a church. Like one that has worldwide prominence and only has, I think, 20 nations that they don't have diplomatic ties with. There's the body so large, they make up so large of a population that they are 1/5 of the world's population in just this one church. To a smaller point, America would be considered a kingdom, or England would be considered a kingdom. Any country that fits into having one ruler or being ruled by the people or by an entity is a kingdom. You know, Pastor preached a couple weeks back on this passage, and he gave some statistics about war. And it's absolutely amazing how violent and how ugly people can be towards each other, and they go to war and they want to fight against each other. But what we see is that war encompasses nation versus nation, or race against race, as we've already seen, as well as kingdom against kingdom. And if you were to say that there's a war between race right now, you'd be correct. Now, it's not a war that's a physical war in most points. It's a war that's a moral and ethical and ideological war. They want to change the way we think. Kingdom against kingdom, we see war destroy the morals of society. We see that the amount of countries that are willing to go to war with each other, and a group, an entity that deems a cause worthy enough to go after it. We deem a cause worthy enough to go after abortion because we believe abortion is wrong. We can be considered a kingdom when we try to go against a nation, when we try to change an ideology, when we try to change a society and morals. But we rejoice when we see kingdom rise against kingdom. Not that you're seeing destruction, but that you're seeing the signs of the end of time. So we see with the rise of kingdom against kingdom and nation against nation, which we've already seen as race, we're starting to build a picture here. And that picture is becoming increasingly clear as the days go on. The signs of the end of time are building up, and it's getting harder and harder not to see that picture right in front of us. We see very clearly that something's going on in our day and age. We've known it. We've seen the difference over the last 20 years of our lives, some over the last 50, some over the last 80. We've seen a major difference in our life. And as we continue this message, I think you'll see an even bigger picture here, and I want to paint the entirety of it at the end. But we see that kingdom against kingdom is something that's happening, and now we see famines. Now, when I came across famines, I was thinking famines of the biblical proportion, like when you think of Joseph. Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph was able to interpret it, and we saw that there was a famine in the land where nothing grew. They had to harvest beforehand. But I never really thought about it in these terms. So what is the definition of famine? It's the scarcity of food, dearth, a general want of provision sufficient enough for inhabitants of a country or a besieged place. There was a famine in the land, Genesis 26. Want, destitution, as a famine of the word of life. So in the Greek here, this was limos, or through the idea of destitution, a scarcity of food, dearth, famine, and hunger. When we look around today and we look at the many nations that have famines going on, a lot of them are man-made. There's starvation going on in their lands, and roughly 40 million people each year on average are starving. And they're spread out across roughly 40 different countries. Now sometimes that number's higher, sometimes that number's lower. But when you think about famine, one thing I thought about too, is just a side note, was that, we live in this great country where we eat like kings. We don't tend to think about that we can go make a meal and we make too much, we put leftovers in the fridge and we forget about them. Well, 5 or 6 days later, they're bad. We take for granted sometimes that we have food. And to our shame, God's blessed us with food, and sometimes we forget. I know it isn't a part of the time part of our topic here on the end times, but I think we need a reminder from time to time to remind us, not to make us feel bad, but to be thankful that we're not in starvation right now and that we're not living in famine, because it could very well come here. Back to the signs of the time, though, we see, if we take an objective look at most of these famines, like I said, they're man-made. They're man-made because the governments are causing this with bad policies. The different governments across the world are causing man-made famine. Now, I don't mean this in a sense of taking away anything from God, because I believe that it's all part of God's plan. We see the signs of the end of time, and we see that God's plan is forming. But I was of the mindset that, like in the days of Joseph, God was going to say, hey, I'm going to put a famine on your land, and you're not going to see your crops grow or anything like that. I never thought about the idea that, we're having food thrown away. I've seen videos where a whole milk truck, the guy is pouring out every single ounce of milk that was on his truck. I've heard of farmers who have received letters where they've been asked to destroy their crops, and the government will pay them our hard-earned tax dollars so that they can do it. If we don't believe that it can't come to us, it can. And the government's doing their best to try to control that and to try to make prices go up, and they're driving everything to that point. That man-made famine is just around the corner. Think of North Korea or Venezuela or Somalia or Yemen. War, climate, and bad policies are all the causes of famine. They're the top causes of why people go hungry. And I believe we've reached the point where this is so rapidly approaching that some Christians aren't paying any attention anymore. They're not paying attention to what's going on. They're not paying attention, and they're going to be caught unaware that the Master's coming, because these signs are all around us right now. Time's running out. I'm not a doomsday person by any stretch of the imagination, but you'll come to realize the more you study this book, the more you'll see that time is drawing near. Time's getting closer. Things are happening. Things are falling into place. We could be living in the very last moments of time. There are only a few people out there telling the truth because people call them crazy. Oh, this ain't happening. This is make-believe. This is a fairy tale, and they're going to be sad to find out one day that it's not a fairy tale. I'm fine with being called a crazy person. Call me a crazy person. But I'm going to tell you about the love of Jesus. I'm going to tell you about salvation and how you can be saved. And if you hear Jesus knocking at the door of your heart, I pray that you answer it, because time is running short. Rejoice when you see the multitude of famines in diverse places. Now, what a strange thing to say, to rejoice that there's famine out there. But rejoice in the fact, not that people are starving, but that we know that Jesus is coming soon because we see the signs of his coming. We've seen famine. Now we see pestilence or pestilent. This is the word that had the most interest to me, and this is one of the things that kicked off this message and this entire study. If you're like me, you would have thought that pestilent or pestilence was a plague, and if you thought that, you're still correct in that thinking, but there's more to it. There's a lot more to that definition, and it encompasses a whole lot of things. So when you look at the definition of pestilent or pestilence, because they're both one and the same, what does it mean? What is pestilence? The producing of a plague or other malignant, contagious disease, noxious to health and life, as a pestilent air or climate, mischievous, noxious to morals or society, destructive, and in a general sense, as a pestilent book, troublesome, mischievous, making a disturbance, corruption, as a pestilent fellow, in Acts 24 and 5. Let's look at that real quick. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So, when you're referred to as a pestilent fellow, you're being noxious to someone's morals or society, or you're being destructive, or you're making a disturbance. See, this is to me where things got interesting when I started looking at this word for word, was that I told you before I would have thought plague. There's more that encompasses that. What I didn't expect to find was definitions such as mischievous or noxious to morals of society, destructive, troublesome, making a disturbance, corrupt, and corruption. And the thought behind this absolutely blew me away, because when you think about the end times, if you look at this definition as a whole, and we're going to see it here in just a second, numerous scenarios can come into play. But just for example, we're also looking at the last two words of Matthew 24:7, in divers places. So based on this, we're looking for pestilence in many places. We're looking for what could be a plague or a major virus. We're looking for being noxious or hurtful, harmful, baneful, pernicious, destructive, and unwholesome. That's what noxious is to morals and society. In our case at the moment, I believe we're seeing both the destruction of morals and society, and some of it's being done through COVID. We see that there's mischievous government officials as well as political operatives that have bad intent, and you can see their intent and you can listen to it because it's troublesome behavior that they're saying. They're making a disturbance to our morals and our society while the stench of their trail goes for miles long. You could see their corruption, you could see how they're trying to disturb us, and it goes back years and years. The very reason I came to this text was I was sitting in my room one day, about a week ago, and I was looking at my radar app. And I saw these little red dots on my radar app, and I saw that there were a bunch of them across the globe. So curious, I clicked on one. It turned out to be an earthquake. My mind was off to the races, and I went straight to Matthew 24, and I started reading that, and I started studying on it. And it's absolutely amazing. But this is what came from it. It came out of a message. And the scriptures that were given is just absolutely amazing. The picture that God placed on my heart about this. I've heard many ask if the coronavirus is the end times plague. If coronavirus is the plague that we're seeing in the end times. To this I would say, I'm not going to say yes or no, but I would not discount the idea based on this picture that I'm going to paint. When you look at the entirety of the virus, it meets the definition of a plague and the destruction of life from a virus. The virus has been hurtful, harmful, destructive, and unwholesome to our society and our morals due to bad policies. The entirety of our mandates across this world have all been about controlling us and our minds. The virus has been troublesome for the society as a whole when you look at the general sense of it. It's caused a disturbance to life as we know it. We've seen corruption from billionaires and politicians alike who are only concerned about their bottom dollar, selling masks and selling vaccines and controlling your business. I mean, think about these plastic companies over the last 2 years and how much money they've made off the coronavirus. It's amazing when you think about it, but we're seeing the systematic destruction of entire society. The monetary system right now is under attack because they say with COVID, they don't want you transferring money back and forth with people. They'd rather you use a card. And that's all getting to one world government. That's all getting to the point where they're pushing us to go to a cashless society, and you lose your ability to barter. All these things as a whole, when you put that entire picture together for what the definition of a plague is, could be the coronavirus. It could very well be. And this, if you look at how hard the coronavirus has hit us, and you look at God saying, hey, I'm trying to show you something, we're very well looking at a picture of the end time. Are you rejoicing that coronavirus is here? Not because it's taking people out, not because it's being destructive to our society, but because it could be potentially that God's showing us that the last times are here, that we're living in the last days, because it is the plague of the end times. It could very well be. We've seen pestilence now. Let's look at our final point, which is earthquakes. Most of us know what an earthquake is, and it's likely some of us have experienced an earthquake at least once in our life. But an earthquake is a shaking, trembling, concussion of the earth, sometimes a slight tremor, and other times violent shaking or convulsions. And at other times, rocking and heaving of the earth. Earthquakes are usually preceded by a rattling sound in the air or by a subterraneous rumbling noise, hence the name earthen, formerly given to earthquake. Like I said, I started this study because I saw these earthquakes all across the map, and they were too numerous to count. But my radar app showed more than 25 over the span of one day. I lost count at 25 because I quit counting them. They were all bunched together. And there's substantial earthquakes that register, but it doesn't account for the ones that don't register, which I've looked at the National Earthquake Information Center records, and on average in our nation, 20,000 earthquakes a year, which equates to about 50 a day. However, there are millions of earthquakes estimated every year that are too weak to be recorded or too remote where our equipment doesn't pick up on them. An earthquake happens somewhere every single day. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that 500,000 detectable earthquakes occur in the world each year. But if you were to look at the data from the last 20 years, you're not going to see significant changes. But what you see is in like early 2000s, you start off with about 24,000 for the year in the United States. We're just using the United States, for example. And then it dips off, and then it comes back up. And over the years, it makes a wave. And if you're looking at it on a graph, that's what it'll look like. It's also similar to what you would see as birth pangs, as someone pointed out to me once. And I think of that, and when I thought about that, I thought about the birth of the end of the age, the end of time. But if you look at the data over the last 100 years, and even over the last 2,000, there's been a significant increase in earthquakes, in the frequency, and how strong they are, how long they're lasting, and it's amazing. You know, I believe the things we're seeing in the heavens as well. Have you looked at the stars? Have you looked at the alignment of the moon in the past couple years? Have you seen the Star of Bethlehem, which they say only comes around once every 12,000 years? These signs, the earthquakes, the famine, the pestilence, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, all point to the imminent return of our Lord Jesus Christ. These are only the beginning, though. Time will not last forever. Take note of the signs going on around us. These things we've seen in the last few years in the heavens are so few and far in between that it has astrologists baffled at the rarity and the occurrence of them. It has them scattering to go find out and go get a picture and a glimpse to see what's going on. Don't be deceived. The time is at hand. We can see the changing of the seasons. And I want to close tonight with a big picture. The big picture of the end of time. There's an all-out war going on against our morals, integrity, race, gender, and other societal norms. We've seen that in the end times, perilous times will come. If you go to that chapter in, I believe it's 2 Timothy, you won't find one of them that you can't go out here and find today. Every single one of them are true right now at this moment. There's 18 traits that can be found out on earth. And that's the perilous times we're living in. So this destruction and this war against our society and what's going on is what's going to be known as a Great Reset. They're trying to train our minds, not us as Christians, but the world, to think like they're thinking. And it's easy to see that that could be transposed to the Antichrist when the Antichrist gets here. Because he's going to have the minds captive and he's going to deceive billions. Billions of people. Plans have been in the works for years. Carefully constructed thoughts have been fed to us through a slow and steady diet. And I just want to look at the last 20 years for an illustration. But over the last 20 years, since 9/11, we've been fed a diet of fear. We've been fed a diet of, hey, let's all be on the same page, because what happened at 9/11 was all these news media outlets saw that they had the power of fear over people when they pushed fear to them. They have a power over them. They've got them fearful. They've got them captive. They're all making a concerted effort now. Every single news media outlet is pushing for you to know what they want you to know. Not what you need to hear, not what you need to see, but what they want you to know. And with the birth of social media too, we're being fed an anti-Christian diet in this world. You don't want to be a Christian, that's a bad thing. You don't want to serve God, that's a bad thing. Stay away from those people. They're crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. They've gone off the deep end. I have a very solemn view on what I'm sharing with you. I look on in awe because I think about Christ showing us this. He showed this to the disciples because the disciples asked, what is the signs of the end of time? And I look on in awe because what we see here right now is that the signs of the end of time are before us. We can see the physical signs of the end of time. Right now is the time to get our heart straight. Right now is the time to get right with God, because if we're right with God and we're ready to go, we should be able to leave this world at a moment's notice. When Jesus says, hey, I'm coming back, you hear that trumpet sound, we should be ready to just drop everything we're doing and go. I'm ready to go. I'm excited. I'm thinking about that. And it's exciting because we no longer will have to see all these things that we've talked about tonight. We'll no longer have to see the destruction of our society, because we'll be up there in heaven with Jesus. I know that there will be people that do get saved during the Great Tribulation, but I think about how hard it'll be living on earth without the Spirit of God present. It'll be very difficult. COVID could also be another piece of this puzzle. It has certainly been a catalyst in the effort to get rid of our monetary system. It's conditioned people to hate those that are unvaccinated or that don't mask up, because you're looked at as pariah and you're looked at as a leper. People don't want to be around you because you think differently than them, because you say, I have the ability to think for myself. When people have these mindsets, it's not hard to imagine that they could soon do worse and they could soon do more. It's easy to transpose that feeling to the mark of the beast. And somebody says, hey, we've been doing temperature checks with COVID. And somebody says, hey, you've got the mark. You're good to go. You can buy or sell whatever you want. All this has been conditioned. They're conditioning the world for the coming of the Antichrist. The mark of the beast. If you don't have the mark of the beast, you won't be able to buy or sell. All this is after we get raptured out, if you're a part of God's church. Thank God. But you'll be known as an outcast. Hey, you don't have the mark. You can't buy or sell. You can't come in here. We don't want you in here. Because if you're against God, then you're for Satan. And if you're against Satan, then you're for God. I'm so thankful that the church is going to be caught up before that, and that we're not going to be here during this great tribulation. Life is going to get worse and worse and worse until the very end, and everything has been fulfilled in the book of Revelation. My question here is simply tonight, do you know Jesus as your Lord and Savior? And if you don't, I pray that you get to know Him today. I pray that if He's knocking at the door of your heart right now, that you open the door and let Him in, because that's the only way that He can come into your heart. He's not going to force entry. The signs are all around us. I believe I've laid out a very well case here that the signs of the end time, we could see through every little study here and every little word that we're seeing things build. As time goes on, it's building more and more. And if you see this message and you hear this knocking at your heart, you hear Jesus knocking at the door of your heart, please come to Him in salvation. Brother, as you come to sing, if you've got something on your heart, you got something that you need to get right with God, if you've got baggage that you're holding on to and you're not ready to drop it,